Hello everyone, my name is Beatrice and welcome back to Lady Disdain Reads. Today I bring to you a discussion of an article by theologian Peter Leithart titled Real Men Read Austen. This is the first essay in a collection Leithart published on Austen titled Miniatures and Morals. It's a highly accessible, concisely written book about Christian virtues in Austen. It includes discussion questions at the end of each chapter, so it's also really good if you want to start a Jane Austen book club. And because it's meant for a more general public, it's less academic, it's less scholarly, and therefore much easier to read either for pleasure or as an introduction to some of the more scholarly works that I often mention on my channel. Now let's get straight into the first essay in this collection, which is called Real Men Read Austen. What does Leithart mean by this humorous title? Well, first of all, Leithart begins his argument by saying that when he told his friends he was going to write a book on Jane Austen, many of his male friends told him, "Oh, why are you doing that?" Whereas none of his female friends seemed surprised at all. What he kind of got from this is that a lot of people see Jane Austen as frivolous. A lot of men that he knows see Austen as kind of silly or superficial. And that's because her works have often been underappreciated, I suppose, due to the misconception that they are all about tea parties and balls and bonnets and dresses, and not really much else. So Leithart makes the insightful point that although many readers enjoy Austen because they experience a sense of nostalgia for a kind of more elegant lost world, in fact, Austen herself is not a nostalgic writer in the slightest. In fact, she is not simply concerned with bonnets and dresses, although those are things that she mentions. It's us as readers that often focus on those elements. Also, he makes the really good point that Jane Austen is not sentimental. She shows no sentimentality in her works in the kind of vein of sentimentality that you would find in someone like Dickens, for example. What else does Leithart do in the first half of his essay? Well, taking this assumption that we often miss the point of her novels, he tries to make the case that this is because Austen's style is very subtle, and we miss those subtleties when we read the novels without really trying to read too much into them. When we just read them for pleasure, we might miss some of the subtleties. So he characterizes Austen, first of all, as a miniaturist in her style, and says this. He says that there is a precision and a lack of ornamentation in her prose that makes every other writer's style seem bloated. I like that he uses that word, bloated. Austen, whilst not being necessarily a concise writer, is a writer who does not use, or does not rather misuse or overuse adjectives and rhetorical devices. Her style, as he says, has no ornamentation. It is not overly ornate. It is not overly, quote-unquote, poetic. It is a clean, it is an elegant, it is a restrained style. As he says, it makes everyone else's style seem bloated. For instance, he points out that one can tell more about a character in Austen by their syntax, meaning by the way they speak, rather than by what they actually say. Austen doesn't need lengthy descriptions of a character's personality, because that character's linguistic idiosyncrasies really speak for themselves. Leithart chooses Mr. Collins as a particularly apt example of this. So he argues this, that Austen rarely uses similes or metaphors, which is true, she doesn't, but that when she does, they are always original and surprising and unexpected expressions. Such as this example, such as in the description in Emma of Mrs. Elton's bonnet and basket. Her bonnet and basket are described as her apparatus of happiness, which is completely unexpected and unusual metaphor to use, and yet one that describes so well what she is like as a character. Furthermore, in a letter to her niece Anna, Austen shows her dislike of overly dramatic or insipid metaphors by warning Anna not to use the phrase vortex of dissipation, which I think is an excellent phrase. It's so funny, it's so overly dramatic, and it's just like Austen to warn her niece not to use it. Sure enough, as Leithart points out, Austen has a character who's as pompous as Mr. Collins use exactly one of those overworked, banal, overdone, common metaphors, such as olive branch, when he writes a letter to Mr. Bennet. So all he can think of to describe his feelings is that he wants to extend an olive branch. It's an overworked, overdone metaphors that fits exactly into his kind of pompous but rather silly character. Now, so far, Leithart has discussed Austen's style. And this is all very interesting. He's shown her to be a subtle, intelligent author who is much less sentimental than one might at first surmise. But what interests me even more about Leithart's essay is the latter half of his essay, where he discusses exactly in what sense Austen's novels deal with ethics. He begins by pointing out that Austen does not deal with extreme life or death ethical situations, but rather with the accumulation of ethical decisions that make up a person's character in everyday life. He sees Austen as an essentially Christian writer, and as an essentially Aristotelean writer, just like Alasdair MacIntyre, whom I've often mentioned on this channel. And Leithart argues as follows. For a Christian writer, the real challenge of life is not to puzzle the ultimate realities, but to live well in very particular social and domestic settings. The moral philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre discerns an Aristotelian trait in Austen's recognition that virtues are formed, tested, and manifested within a community. As Aristotle pointed out, this makes ethics a subdivision of politics. That is, it makes the question, what should I do, a sub-question under what kind of community do I wish to live in, and what is my place in it. I think this is an excellent point that Leithart is making. And what's crucially important to understand here is that for Aristotle and for MacIntyre and Leithart, and of course for Austen, as they argue, ethics is not a kind of universal abstract or a set of abstract universals or universal rules, but it is informed by the context of the political community one is part of. So if you have watched my video on why Austen is not a Kantian thinker, this will sound familiar to you because I argue exactly this, that this is not how Austen thinks of morality, that she's not Kantian in her thinking of morality. But if you haven't seen this video yet, I'll leave it linked down below, and I suggest you watch it because what I'm saying now will make more sense. So Leithart gives a couple of examples of this kind of thinking about ethics in Austen, which I think is very helpful. For instance, Mr. Darcy, when trying to decide whether to propose to Elizabeth, takes both his and her social status into consideration, deliberating on whether their union would be beneficial not only to themselves, but to their society or their community as a whole. This doesn't mean that he is callous or unfeeling or cold. It just means that he recognizes that being virtuous means not being a virtuous individual, isolated in the world as his own island. It means being virtuous within a community. And similarly, when Mr. Knightley reproaches Emma's mocking behaviour towards Miss Bates during their picnic, he does so relying on the assumption that Emma's higher social status should restrain her from belittling someone who is less fortunate than herself, meaning that her belittling of Miss Bates is a worse moral offence because Emma is of a higher social status. However, as Leithart clarifies, none of this means that we're talking about moral relativism. He argues this: it does not mean that there are no absolutes of right and wrong, but it does mean that the absolutes have particular applications to particular people in particular circumstances. So there are still some moral absolutes, but the way in which one follows what is right will depend on the social context that one finds himself in, essentially. Now, here is a further example of how Leithart sees Austen as very much an Aristotelian rather than a Kantian. He argues that ethics is not just about individuals seeking to live a good life or about solitary decision-making, trying to achieve ethical perfection. We are simply not isolated like that. That's another excellent point. Like Aristotle thought, the ethical life is lived in a political community and must seek to benefit the community as a whole as well as the individual. And you see that very much so in Austen, because characters are concerned with what would be best for their family, with what would be best for their entire local community, not just for what would be best for themselves. The characters who do think about what would be most beneficial to themselves are the ones that are punished. They're characters like Lydia and Mr. Wickham. Now, having argued all of this, Leithart concludes that Austen is much more of a serious thinker than people often give her credit for, hence the title Real Men Read Austen. He even goes as far as to suggest that Austen is a public theologian, which I think is an interesting claim, and that she is the most theologically sophisticated of English novelists. Now, that is a very big claim to make, and I completely agree with it, but it might sound unusual to some of you. So he goes on to argue, and I'll try to sum it up here, that although she may not have translated works of theology like George Eliot did, or have been as explicit or sentimental in her religious sentiment, like Dickens, of course, there is a kind of much deeper understanding of what it means to live a Christian life in a specific social context in Austen than in either of those writers, so in either Eliot or Dickens or any other 19th century writer. And I obviously agree with this claim, and I want to finish the video here for today, but I hope that I've at least persuaded you to read more of Leithart's work on Austen. Many of his articles are just available online, so you don't need to purchase a book or find it at the library. You can just do a quick Google search. And I like the idea of Austen as a public theologian so much that I really look forward to making more videos on this topic and kind of analysing and expanding on his idea in more detail. So thank you for watching for today, and I'll see you in my next video, which hopefully will be the beginning of my series on Austen's minor works, now that we've covered the major 6 novels rather. So it will be on Austen's short epistolary novel, Lady Susan. So see you then, and I hope you enjoyed today's video, and goodbye.